Greetings. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Happy Wednesday. Very excited that you all are here with us for just an exciting session today. We'll just kick off with some introductions. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, put an emoji. How are you feeling today? I am Sheba Rogers with the Detroit Justice Center and a part of the MySemi steering team. Very excited to welcome and lead us in our session today with some other amazing partners. So I am excited to just kick us off today and shout out the amazing group that's been pulling this learning community series together alongside MySemi and through our collaborative with MySemi is the Detroit Justice Center, Michigan Roundtable for Just Communities, Friends of Restorative Justice, and Emergent Justice. So just shouting out our partners that's been working month to month to plan this session and to hear from you what other topics you might want to explore as we come into 2025. Today, we will do a quick overview of our session today. It's going to be a little different. We'll go through our community agreements as well as the learning community overview. I'm going to pass it off to our wonderful moderator who's going to lead us in a panel discussion on harm reduction as we explore non-carceral responses to substance use, mental health, and more. We'll then have questions for our panelists. We'll wrap up with some next steps and a preview for December and what our time will look like in December together. So very excited about that. Just for anyone who is new with us today, we do have community agreements, and we always welcome in any new agreements if there are more we would like to see in this space. What we have agreed to and would like to see within this space today is, of course, respecting others and bringing our authentic selves into this conversation. We want to be present and engage as needed. So if your engagement is in the chat, if you want to come off mute, if you like to use emojis, please take this time to be present and to engage with us. We also agree to just be flexible and flow as we need to. Sometimes things change and shift. Sometimes we may take a little longer in the presentation. Like we like this space to be flexible so that it is in honor of us and that it is meeting our needs. We also promote this space to be open-minded. We ask everyone to be open-minded. Different views, different strategies, different ideas and opinions are shared, and it may not be what you may practice or be familiar with, but we ask for everyone to be open-minded and respectful of different opinions and ideas. We may not always agree, but we're all here for the same purpose. Also, step up and step back is a practice we have here. If you're someone who likes to ask a lot of questions or speak a lot, we ask that you maybe step back and allow others' voices to be heard as well. Respect the mic, one speaker at a time, so that we are not speaking over each other. We're not too big on sort of whether or not you must use the hand raise feature, but it does support the process as we build a stack and know how to call on folks. And if there's anything else you would like to see added to these agreements, please feel free to drop it in the chat and or email Chuck, Jen, myself, the MySemi team, and we'll make sure those are included in the next month's presentation. But if you have anything, we'd love for you to drop it in. We could even get a consensus now with some thumbs up if that's something we'd like to add. I do see something here with open-mindedness. Discomfort is okay and part of growth. Thank you, Kat, for that. Yes, agree with that. I don't see anything else in terms of the agreements, but if you have anything else, we'd love to welcome that in and include those, because this is a community where we see ourselves growing, not just staying stagnant and adhering to things that may no longer be serving us. So with that, yes, next slide, Chuck. exciting part. You can tell I'm excited. So, yes, I am so very excited to share more information with you about this unique collaboration this month for the learning community. This month, this learning community is in partnership with the Detroit Justice Center Partner Convening on Mental Health, which is kicking off December 11th and 12th. So just a few short weeks away. We reached out to my semi just to say, hey, how about a collaborative session so that we can elevate and extend the conversation that we'll be having with the convening? We believe this conversation will be relevant to the learning community, and let's just do a big virtual session. And my semi, of course, agreed. And so here we are. In 2023, the Detroit Justice Center began expanding our Divest Invest program area, which I helped to lead. And we decided to include a deeper focus on understanding areas where Detroiters are in need of increased investment and support. We know that sustainable change comes from investing in people, not in jails and prisons. And so we decided to do a deeper dive into understanding the landscape of Detroit's ecosystem of care through a series of research and learning meetings with grassroots, community-based, and system agency leaders. The learnings and key takeaways and the insights gleaned over this 2-year project was the foundation for planning a partner convening that would uplift mental health, substance use recovery, and harm reduction, which we know are major contributors to incarceration and police interaction, and often harmful police interactions. We realized that a collaborative space was needed for us to gather in person, to explore and wrestle with our unique barriers and challenges here locally, and that's here in Detroit, as well as to explore ideas for how to address some of our gaps in care and the needed supports and services that we still want to see happen. DJC began meeting with community partners to collaborate in the planning and the hosting of a local partner convening. And so we're very excited about that. You have the details here on the slide, December 11th and 12th at Focus Hope. And so, again, we are collaborating with my semi for this 2-part series. We'll be back again December 18th to continue hearing from this dynamic panel. For the convening, as you see here, we do have 3 primary goals. One is extending the ecosystem scan learnings and building a library of useful resources, recommendations, and strategies tailored to Detroit, and ultimately to collaborate with you all in this knowledge building and ultimately share these tools and resources out with our networks, of course, with you all, so that we can all become more aligned in values and practices. We also see as a key focus of the convening is strengthening collaboration and breaking down silos in our ecosystems of care, with the aim of course, strengthening integration of care, coordination of services, and cross-sector partnerships. Additionally, and lastly, we want to center discussions that explore non-carceral responses to mental health, substance use, and harm reduction. So as you can see, we do have a lot packed in our time together, both virtually and next month. I would love to just shout out some of the partners who are helping to plan that convening. The Wayne State Center for Behavioral Health and Justice, Moratorium Now Coalition, Free People, Michigan Liberation, and of course, Answer Detroit. So we have a ton of awesome partners that are helping to plan the convening. I won't have as much time to get into some of the other highlights, but if you are interested, please sign up for the convening and you'll hear more from me about the panels. This is our first kickoff panel on harm reduction. We're going to have another panel that's going to break it all the way down for you on our current landscape. Some of you may be like, I didn't know that we were even experiencing issues around harm reduction, or what is that? What kind of challenges are we having around mental health and decriminalizing mental health, right? So our panel on night 1 is going to kick off that current landscape conversation and answer additional questions we all may have. Day 2, we're going to get into more of like the dreaming and what's possible and what are some of the innovations that we're seeing happen in the field. With that, I am going to introduce our moderator who's going to kick us off into this conversation. Alexandria Hughes is a sister in the movement, a friend, a comrade, a University of Michigan graduate who currently works as a project coordinator with the Wayne State University Center for Behavioral Health and Justice. Her background is in ABA therapy, where she practiced as a behavioral health therapist in K-12 schools. She has also served as a community organizer with groups such as Michigan Liberation, Livonia Equity, and Anti-Racism Network, and Accountability for Dearborn. Alexandria is also one of the partners helping to plan the convening with us next month, and I am deeply grateful for her and the partnership, and also just have to shout out that Alexandria recently became a DJC board member. So with that, I just want to welcome Alexandria.
Thank you so much for the amazing intro, Sheba. And I'm so excited to have you all here today. This is a really important issue that's very close to my heart. Too often, the standard response to substance use and mental health crisis has been carceral. This approach to use police and prisons to try and stop certain behaviors has failed to address the root causes that drive those behaviors. And the criminalization and stigma increase the dangers for participants and for the public at large. I know from personal experience how bad it is, but at Wayne State, I've seen the research. I've seen the research Wayne State has done on the metro area alone. We are in a state where over half, 55% to be exact, of individuals booked into 10 of our county jails in the metro area reported problematic substance use. Many individuals booked into our county jails has an indication of a mental health disorder as well. And on top of that, we have a president who has threatened to give all law enforcement officers qualified immunity regardless of their actions. This is why we must move forward in a transformative way. Harm reduction takes a radically different approach. Rather than criminalizing behavior, this approach supports people engaged in these activities to make safer choices to protect their health and the broader public. This learning community series is for individuals who are parents, part of organizations interested in incorporating new strategies, or if you're a community member, this space is for you. This series is about learning from people who are doing harm reduction work, the work on the front end that needs to happen so that incarceration does not happen to people who use drugs or have mental health conditions. And with that, we're going to transition into our amazing speakers. Our first speaker, Z. St. James, is an organizer with Answer Detroit, building networks of mutual aid and community-based care. Their advocacy work includes providing subject matter experts on the intersections of sex work and harm reduction at the local, state, and federal level. Take it away, Z.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Like Alexandra just said, I'm Z St. James. I go by they and he. I'm an organizer and collective member with Answer Detroit. Answer Detroit is a sex worker justice collective. This means we're by sex workers for sex workers. We do harm reduction work and power building. We practice mutual aid as an organizing strategy to honor the material realities of sex workers in the Detroit area. And if you want to know more about what mutual aid is, I'll be posting resources in the chat. And yeah, we're out here fighting for decriminalization of sex work. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to give a short introduction to harm reduction. First, we'll ground the conversation in some harm reduction histories. Then we'll learn about harm reduction as a movement versus harm reduction as a practice. And finally, I'll go over harm reduction approaches to drug use and sex work. And then one more note before we get started. Thank you to Ashley Shukite, who you'll hear from later, who graciously let me use some of her slides from previous presentations and who helped me edit the slides in general. A lot of the words you'll see are hers. Next slide. So let's take a look at some of these pictures for a second. Is anyone familiar with any of the movements or activists portrayed in them? You can type it in the chat if you are. Yeah, Marsha P. Johnson. Anything, if you want to share some information, yeah, act up. If you can answer who were they and what were they fighting for in a nutshell. Although I will go over it in a second. And also if not, it's okay. We're gonna talk about it.
Did you want people to come off mute or put it in the chat?
Whatever's easiest.
And so what I'm familiar with ACT UP working is during the AIDS epidemic when there was no attention, funding, research, or public education, and just shame-based responses to it. They were fighting for visibility, harm reduction, and attention to AIDS for people who are living with the disease.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much, Chuck. Looks like some people have heard of Coyote. Awesome. Well, so the history of harm reduction is a history of survival and civil disobedience. Before harm reduction practices were recognized as public health strategies, it came from marginalized, so criminalized communities. Harm reduction is rooted in those same survival strategies that Black, brown, queer, and trans communities use to stay safe. Although it might seem like a new concept for many of us, it's not new at all. These movements go back to the middle of the last century. We don't have time to go over every picture, but I'll highlight a few. So someone mentioned Marsha P. Johnson. So Star House, those are the middle two pictures there. And again, whether it's acknowledged in history books or not, oppressed people have always organized themselves through informal support networks of mutual aid and community-based care, especially in communities of color. A great example of this is Star House. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera are known well for their activism, including the Compton cafeteria riots and the Stonewall Bar uprising. Let's not forget that being gay and trans used to be illegal. What often goes unmentioned is their activism with STAR, which stands for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Yes, there's some outdated language there. It was a different time. This eventually turned into Star House, where Riviera and Johnson would use their earnings as sex workers to provide a place for unhoused youth who had been kicked out for being queer to stay. But Star also organized actions like in the picture where they're protesting outside of the New York House of Detention. ACT UP, like Chuck said, from their website, is AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and founded in New York City in 1987 as political action group in response to the AIDS crisis. The group's first action was in the spring of 1987, and it was a march on Wall Street to protest the high costs and lack of availability of HIV treatment. Over its 25 years, ACT UP has successfully protested different government and organizations in order to create change. This includes, like I said, the Wall Street pharmaceutical companies for profiteering from people with AIDS by charging really high prices for medication, as well as government officials and institutions that held power over addressing the AIDS crisis, like the FDA, the CDC, and the NIH. And they are still around to this day. So you can check out their website here. They've got a lot of really cool archival resources. And then last was highlight sex worker movements. So someone mentioned Coyote. Sex worker movements have a long history, but have gone unrecognized by the public health side of harm reduction. So yes, sex workers have always been here in the US. The sex worker rights movement really picked up in the mid 1970s. So Coyote, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics, was founded by Margot St. James and other sex workers. Heavily involved in the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s, St. James was arrested and charged with prostitution, even though she did not do sex work. Ironically, St. James actually started doing sex work after she was charged because her criminal record got in the way of other employment. And that's when she started organizing. This inspired sex workers around the country to mobilize, each with their own origin stories, of course. And by the 1990s, sex worker organizations were getting funding for harm reduction work. They gave out condoms and needles, hosted the bad rap girls groups, and made educational resources by and for sex workers. As you can see, this work continues to this day, not just with Answer Detroit, but across the country and around the world. And we don't have time for it, but Drug User Liberation Front at the bottom, I encourage you to check them out. It's drug user organizing out of Canada, and they are organizing for safe supply. All right, next slide. Thank you. So when we talk about harm reduction with a capital H, capital R, we're talking about harm reduction as a movement or a liberatory practice. Many of us might use the term liberatory harm reduction to refer to this movement. If you want to learn more about liberatory harm reduction, including movement histories, I highly recommend Saving Our Own Lives by Shira Hassan, link right here. And again, harm reduction movements are rooted in queer, trans, Black, brown, people who use drugs and sex worker survival systems. Thank you, Ashley. Liberatory harm reduction recognizes that we don't live in a vacuum, but we live under structural oppression, and this affects how vulnerable we are and our ability to access resources. Harm reduction as a movement is a practice of transformative justice, shifting power and resources to people who've been historically marginalized in order to heal. We can honor survival and healing without condemning or glorifying how people heal. There's no one right way, and everyone heals differently. All right, next slide. So let's talk about harm reduction, the kind most of us are probably familiar with. So lowercase h, lowercase r, harm reduction. It's both an approach and a set of practical strategies to promote any positive change. And as defined by the individual, not by the courts, not by your mama, but by the individual. And some everyday examples include seatbelts, helmets, wear sunscreen to prevent skin cancer, get a vaccine so you don't get polio, all of those things. For substances specifically, think about nicotine patches or gum so you're not just quitting cold turkey. Designated drivers for alcohol if you're going out partying with friends, decaf coffee, and sugar substitutes. The practice of harm reduction gives us a code of ethics to follow to make sure we're centering compassion and dignity in our responses, whether or not the person's choices make sense to us. All right, next slide. So now that we've talked about the big H, big R harm reduction and little h, little r, let's talk about why people use drugs. And people use drugs for a variety of reasons. There can be multiple reasons at a time. And of course, these reasons can change as time goes on. People self-medicate for physical and mental conditions. They use drugs for religious and ceremonial practices, for pain management, physical and psychological, for fun and recreation, for protection, to calm down, as social lubricant, for curiosity and experiment purposes, and for getting well if you are going through withdrawal and dependent on drugs. So acknowledging all the reasons is really important. All right, next slide. So first, if someone wants to come off you or put it in the chat, what does it mean to be pathologized? Has anyone heard that term before?
To me, pathologizing is like reducing people to like a diagnosis or experience and kind of like limiting them into that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say when people look at the conditions that people are facing and dealing with and say it's their fault, there's something wrong with them, they're suffering from some sort of inner illness, when in fact a lot of times folks have been put upon and forced to survive in certain ways, and those external factors have never been looked at. They just say it's the fault of the person and say you have an illness.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Um, So like we said, it's kind of to treat someone as other or psychologically abnormal, can have social consequences, like socially diseased. It can look like being treated like a child, like the person doesn't have or deserve their own autonomy, that they're not capable or deserving of making their own choices, like they're not a whole adult human being. So many people assume that people who use drugs are sick or diseased in some way. Assuming that anyone who uses drugs has a disorder can be really dangerous and cause additional harms. As we can see in the diagram, it's a spectrum of, no use to experimental, social, recreational, and then, 10 to 30% of people might have a substance use disorder, and that can go from mild to severe. And people who do have substance use disorders have the right to decide when and if they seek treatment. That is their decision. Individuals also have the right to decide what kind of treatment they want. Maybe it's not complete abstinence. So this is kind of a good intro to harm reduction approach to drug use. Next slide. I think I've got 3 more slides. I'm going to try to finish up with the harm reduction approach to sex work. So first, what is sex work? What does it mean? Sex work is the exchange of sexual services for resources. Resources can be money, drugs, other things of value, or, trading sex for survival needs. What do we mean by sexual services? It can look different. So physical contact, like escorting, street-based sex work, domination and fetish work, body work, like massage businesses and body rubs. It can be in proximity, so in close distance to the client, but no sexual contact is involved. So the old-fashioned peep shows, not really allowed anymore, or strip clubs. Or can be completely distant, so no physical contact. Maybe you're not even in the same zip code. Webcam work, porn work. Lots of people are familiar with OnlyFans. And it's important to note that a lot of these activities, we just named a bunch of them. Some of them are legal and regulated, and others are explicitly illegal and criminalized. And then there's some things that kind of fall into a legal gray area, which has been swinging more into the criminalized category lately. But we're going to talk about that in the next learning session, where another Answer Detroit organizer will join us to lead a breakout session talking about the legal landscape for sex workers in Michigan. And then we can discuss together what the impact is on the health, safety, and human rights of sex workers. But yeah, can do next slide. Previous slide, sorry. You were correct. Okay, so now that we know what sex work is, I like to call this slide, but what about trafficking? Where does that factor in? And again, today, we're not going to talk about what the law says about trafficking. So the legal definition, we're going to save that to the next session. Today, we're going to talk about the literal definition of trafficking in terms of labor and consent. We call these the 3 C's, or choice, circumstance, and coercion. We also call it the spectrum of agency. So what is agency? It's the level of control you have over yourself and your circumstances. In the United States, people's options and choices about what kinds of work they do are really influenced by their circumstances, and agency is not always straightforward. Agency over the type of work you do exists on a spectrum. Just like sex work, most work in the United States is chosen from limited options. So it's in this yellow category. This means that I would leave the work if I have better options. So that's, the majority of sex workers that fall into this category. And as you can see, the red and green categories are much smaller. That's because they're the furthest ends of the spectrum. On one end, we have work that is freely chosen, meaning I have a range of options, but I choose to do this anyway, for whatever reason. And on the other end, you have work by force, fraud, or coercion, which is the definition of human trafficking. Just because you start at one end of the spectrum doesn't mean you're going to stay there. Again, these things can change over time. All right. Big breath. One last slide. Thank you. So let's finish up by talking about what does a harm reduction approach look like to when we're talking about sex work. So it can be providing safer sex supplies like condoms and lube, sharing safety tips and resources, like the exercise of threat modeling, safety planning, and providing self-defense items. It can mean access to legal resources and support. So know your rights info, making case of arrest plans, and providing information on local sex work laws. And then it can also look like creating safer spaces for sex workers to meet. Some examples are, peer support spaces and mutual aid networks. And I will close before handing this to Valerie by reading some of the words in the picture. It says, hashtag not your rescue project. Sex workers took care of you. Sex workers paid for your health care. Sex workers got arrested for you. Without us, there is no liberation. Or I'll pass it back to Alexandria, actually.
Thank you so much, Z. Such a wealth of information. It's so important to have that history to know why we're doing this, to guide us. So our next speaker we have here is Valerie Kelly Bonner, as the founder and executive director of Strategies to Overcome Obstacles and Avoid Recidivism. She considers herself as a CPO, Chief People Officer, with over 20 years of leadership experience across multiple industries. She is most fulfilled when she is empowering others and has a global responsibility for the engagement, development, and empowerment of the world's greatest asset, its people. Her work is informed by her deep understanding of the unique challenges disenfranchised and marginalized communities face. She is specifically attuned to the challenges of people who use drugs, the Black community, and more importantly, the potential. The floor is yours, Valerie.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. And as she said, I'm the founder and executive director of SOAR. I wear multiple hats. I am also an activist, and I go under the Real Black Coffee under that term. So if you hear a little bit of that coming out, I wanted to explain where that was coming from before I dive into this topic. So at SOAR, our mission is to implement leadership strategies. We encourage, enlighten, and empower individuals facing historic exclusion and oppression by integrating life skills programming, harm reduction, and substance use prevention services, stimulating positive personal change that leads to more productive lives while dismantling systemic racism. Next slide, please. No judgment zone. We don't judge anybody. We are not in the business of forcing transformation on anyone, but we foster an environment that will allow transformation to take place if that's what a person desires. We meet them exactly where they are, and if that's where they choose to stay, that is okay with us. Next slide, please. So, realities of drug use under criminalization. It decreases access to medical and social services. It worsens the social determinants of health. There's a lot of restrictions on housing, access, public benefits. Lately, we've been having a lot of pharmacy deserts. Pharmacies are closing, large pharmacies, Rite Aids, CVS, Walgreens, primarily in BIPOC communities. Even I have a pharmacy hat that I wear also. So even if it is legal to get cough medicine with codeine in it, and if I'm on the west side and I come in and I don't look a certain way, the pharmacist is just going to tell me they don't have it, even though they probably do have it. It's just the way I look and where I am. Increased infectious diseases and overdoses. Human rights violations, especially these paraphernalia tickets and all of these other things that are going on, which we'll get into a little bit later. Next slide, please. The realities of a BIPOC harm reductionist. I'm catching hell. Even if I go into the communities that are BIPOC communities, and I am a BIPOC member of that community, I'm catching hell. But there are a lot of reasons why. Some are in a historical context from just what we've been through as a race of people, and others is just pure ignorance, and others is because of someone's spiritual beliefs of what they think they can just pray away and what they think they can do with someone who sins differently than they do. We'll say it that way. So there are intersectional barriers, discrimination from race and sex, and additional obstacles. Again, that whole pharmacy situation. If I don't look a certain way and I go in and ask for that cough medicine with the codeine in it, which they can give me across the counter, if I don't look the part, they're not going to give it to me no matter how bad I could really be hacking. Because of the way I look, they probably think I have a drug use problem or use drugs, and they will refuse to give that to me. Community trust, lived experiences help build trust, but it takes a lot because people have been hurt and damaged and almost destroyed by systems. So it takes a lot to build up trust to do this work as a harm reductionist so people can really understand. A lot of people, when I first started doing this work a few years ago, would ask me, are you working with the police? Why are you doing this? Why do you even care about us? Why? So it took me the longest to say, no, you can take these supplies. I've gone to city council. They have changed their paraphernalia ordinances. This is not illegal for you to have, but it took a lot of work. I was catching hell doing it. So the advocacy is important. I use my voice to highlight issues that could be overlooked by other people or misunderstood by other people. I'm the voice for the voiceless, and I will stand for those who cannot stand for themselves, and I will speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. Next slide, please. Self-care takes a lot, to balance what I go through on a day-to-day basis, and then to be able to not necessarily turn it off because it never goes away. I do this because of my passion. But still, I have a family of my own. I have other things that I should be doing. So I have to take care of myself. I can't help anyone else if I can't help myself. Visibility and representation. Sometimes I inspire others and help diversify this field. Most of the time I piss people off, because doing what's right by marginalized people is not popular. So, a lot of times I piss people off with what I say and what I do, because people don't realize, as someone said earlier, Kat, I believe it was, that sometimes, stretching yourself is uncomfortable. Listening to something that you don't believe in is uncomfortable. Listening is an art, though. Most of us listen to hear, not necessarily understand. We listen to hear so we can reply, not necessarily understand. And if someone is saying something that we don't agree with that goes against our morals and values or whatever, then that makes it even harder. Next slide, please. So navigating these realities requires strength, empathy, perseverance, but the impact that I make on the lives of those who I care about the most is invaluable. And those are marginalized people, people who use drugs, and people who are disenfranchised. Next slide, please. As I said before, there's some historical reasons why people feel the way they do when you're trying to do this work, especially harm reduction. There's a deep-seated mistrust. If we go back to when syphilis first came out, you know, Miss Evers Boys is a great movie to show the depiction where the federal government did an experiment in the Black community, and the individual soldiers didn't even know what was going on. So there's a lot of historical trauma. There's a lot of mistrust, that cultural sensitivity piece. You know, sometimes it's a one size fits all, and people aren't really looking at what is best or culturally relevant for this community or population of people. They just design something and execute it. And my thing is nothing for them without them. Did you ask them? You know, they're not just part of the problem, they're part of the solution. And if you want the best solution, you should probably include them. But that's not the norm. They make up laws and things that are really punitive and carceral in some cases. But again, nothing for them without them. They should be sitting at the table making the decisions if it's going to affect them. And there are socioeconomic barriers that we see that exacerbate substance use issues and other issues and make it harder for people to access not just harm reduction services, any services that's required to assist with social determinants of health. It makes it very difficult. Next slide, please. Policy and policing. We already know about the disproportionate drug policies and policing that happens in BIPOC communities. So I don't even have to really delve into that. We see it all the time. It's just devastating to see it now happening with people that suffer from mental illness. It's always very difficult to know that, you know, some of these cases could have been a trip to the hospital instead of a trip to the morgue. And that devastates me every time I see or hear it. Building trust with the communities requires collaboration of the local leaders, the organizers, influencers. You know, we have more influencers in the Black community than pastors. And I'm going to say that again. We have more influencers in the Black community than pastors, because in certain cases, pastors are the worst. You know, they are looking at things from that spiritual lens, but forgetting that Jesus loved everybody. You know, and some of them will say, you know, I'm saved, and think you can just pray things away, but they forget about what they got saved from and how they should have compassion from people who they think they're trying to save. So, you know, I am encouraging you to look for other people who are trusted and respected in BIPOC communities, because pastors aren't the only ones. Next slide, please. Stigma. Stigma is horrible. It affects access to services, barriers to care, and people will isolate themselves because of what they think others think or know about them or past experiences when trying to access harm reduction services, medical services, or any type of service. That fear of judgment or feeling unworthy overshadows everything else that they're trying to do. Next slide, please. Excuse me. They internalize what they have experienced, and from there, it leads to feelings of shame, low self-worth, sometimes even suicidal ideation. So it takes policy and advocacy work to address the stigma that's associated with these things to help it stop and to educate people on what not to do. Next slide, please. So we have to promote empathy when it becomes harm, when it's related to harm reduction work. People shouldn't die because they get high. You know, it's a lot of things that we could do to put together the realities of substance use and utilize effective harm reduction strategies and educate people that these are public health tools, nothing more, nothing less. Next slide, please. So you can flip to the next slide, please. I'm going to address that. So, and the next one, because we talked about that as well. We're always fighting. We have a long history of fighting for equity and justice in BIPOC communities, but especially when it comes to harm reduction programs, we need to prioritize social justice and health equity so we can mitigate the marginalization of people who use drugs and anything else that they may be experiencing at the time. Right now, Inkster, Westland, Romulus, and Garden City is responsible for the majority of new HIV cases in Wayne County, and out of that number, 8 out of 10 is a Black woman. So we have a lot of work to do when it comes to harm reduction in BIPOC communities. Next slide, please. Power and privilege. Combining our power in the BIPOC community with the privilege of our white allies makes a powerful force for justice. We need to join forces. We can do this together. Doing it together, we leverage the strengths to advocate for policies, support community initiatives, equity and inclusion, and create solidarity. This is the part of harm reduction that I catch the most hell, but it's the most inspiring. Next slide, please. That is it. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Ashley. Well, back to Alexandria.
Yes, thank you so much, Valerie. Yes, we have to be in unity on these issues. The interconnectedness with them is real and it impacts us all. So our next speaker, we have Ashley Shukite, pronouns she and her. Ashley is a liberatory harm reductionist and public health consultant in Southeast Michigan. Her work is dedicated to building power through collective actions centered on health equity, racial justice, and human rights. Michigan Drug Users Health Alliance is a mission-driven alliance committed to actions guided by our shared philosophies and practices focused on human rights and health-centered solutions that promote autonomy, dignity, health, equity, and racial justice with people who use drugs and engage in sex work. Current projects include advocacy efforts for authorization of harm reduction and decriminalization of health tools, including drug checking technologies, such as House Bills 5178 and 5179, and overdose prevention centers across Michigan. Community voices for compassionate overdose responses and equity access to evidence-based substance use management services. Floor is yours, Ashley.
Hey everyone. So Alexandria just said what Michigan Drug Users Health Alliance is. Really, it came together with a lot of us collectively doing syringe service programming. And we were all being criminalized, and our participants were being criminalized. And we recognized that we were all sharing resources, and we wanted to build upon those efforts. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to be very frank on this and just kind of lay it out how it is, because I know this is recorded and everybody can like read through it. So syringe service programs used to be called needle exchanges or syringe access programs. The language has changed because of more comprehensive services, but also just to go with how stigma can play into some of the verbiage that we use. And so throughout Michigan, harm reduction has been here since the late 90s. And the syringe service programs, there were 4 legacy programs throughout the state. I was fortunate enough to have a relationship and be a participant of one before really there was any acknowledgement that they existed amongst a public health scale, right? It was people doing the right thing to make sure others did not get HIV or hepatitis C when they used drugs. And so throughout this, because of drug law history, syringe service programs are being restricted throughout the state because of these old, antiquated laws on the books. So currently, under state law, syringes and other equipment provided by health programs are not classified as drug paraphernalia. However, what we've learned as syringe services have started to expand back around 2017, 2018, that throughout the 1,700 municipalities in Michigan, the majority of them enforce paraphernalia ordinances that criminalize the possession of these public health tools and trace amounts of residue substances within these supplies. These laws deem life-saving supplies like paraphernalia, fentanyl test strips, and other drug checking equipment as paraphernalia. And so there's a lot of police discretion, which can leave people in jail with devastating effects, as well as even if this law is aligned with the HB 5178 and 5179, it is limited. And I think that's an important discussion to bring forth, that it's not fully equitable. It's the bare minimum that we should have been operating at. Next slide. And this is to highlight something that we don't have every city, which I wish we did, but the wonderful people who have been allies at MDHHS to help us with our harm reduction efforts provided this a while ago, and it looked at the state and local laws, and it was 2 maps. So one was with drug paraphernalia, and on the left side where it was red, and those have those drug paraphernalia laws. And on the right side, it was a hepatitis C heat map. And so you could see in the lower right corner where it was darker, there were also paraphernalia laws. And so this is kind of predicted modeling throughout different states. It's evidence throughout, the nation that we've had since the late 90s, that when things like health tools are criminalized, individuals are unable to access them and have to resort to lasting measures such as sharing syringes. Next slide. And so this really creates a conundrum. I used to be a manager at one of the legacy harm reduction programs. And so we were in this weird territory where the area did have a paraphernalia ordinance across the street. And so people had to leave. And as soon as they left, they would be criminalized. And so with this great initiative, more syringe service programs got more money so they could expand their capacity, reach more individuals, but the laws weren't changed. And so what does that look like? This is a real ticket. This is from a friend of mine that is no longer here. They were very criminalized, and it led to their jail and decrease in tolerance. And so they used a loan and died, all because they were so scared to go back to jail for their substance use disorder. And so when we look at this, like, what if our clients, whether you're a social worker or a healthcare provider and your patients, what if they live on the wrong side of the street? Does that mean they have to reuse their syringes? Are they allowed to have fentanyl test strips? And will they develop a felony for returning syringes? Or what about people who are just being good humans and cleaning up their communities from dirty syringes, right? Like, are they going to get a 4-year felony for cleaning up their area so kids don't, interact with any types of needles on the ground? And I think that brought in a lot of questions for us about what about programs and services, service providers. Next slide. So this is a very specific case that happened this year. And what does substance use treatment look like under prohibition in Michigan? So an individual left their substance use treatment facility. This individual is unhoused. When they were walking back to their camp, they did have 2 needles in their backpack. They were packaged. This was because of the unhoused communities, lack of resources and treatment. We know there's a higher percentage of HIV and hepatitis C, so this individual wanted to make sure that other people were not sharing supplies. And so he didn't, he wanted to make sure that he was doing his part to help prevent any types of infection. And so as he was walking back, he was stopped. He was searched. There was no crime, no reason. When individuals sometimes are, after they just received methadone, they can appear sleepy. And that has more to do with failed and limited policies within the clinics with not allowing split dosing. And so the police officer gave them the option. Do you want to go to jail or the hospital? They picked the hospital. Well, at the hospital, they were given the naloxone. They were not overdosing, so there was no clinical indications. And they still received that paraphernalia ticket. When we got a hold of it right away, the public defender wanted them to plead guilty. But we knew better as a participant and had their participant card with them, but also that they were targeted, leaving their substance use disorder, facility. And we were able to find an awesome attorney that did some work pro bono. And that was the first time, I think, in the last, 15, 20 years that I have ever found an attorney that wanted to take on the case. And I have to really thank some individuals that I know are in the chat for having that connection with this attorney, because we've never had that before. Nobody ever cared. They just wanted the person to plead guilty, which, is going to put them at risk for immediate harms, but also what does that do, for their quality of life and their recovery journey? And so throughout July to October, there were multiple court dates. There was fighting with community corrections and like, oh, they have to do drug tests. No, they don't, like this back and forth. Very rude remarks from the prosecutors. And yet this attorney still pressed on. And finally, I think when it was realized that there was a ADA potential for a jury case, the case was dismissed. So all these years, dozens, thousands of people have been receiving paraphernalia tickets in the state of Michigan and specifically Southeast Michigan. And a lot of them are ADA violations, right? Like, I'm not a lawyer, but it's very clear as day when someone leaves treatment and they're still being penalized, that this is really concerning. And so it further kind of pushed what we've been working on with changing the state law. Next slide. That one's good. You can go to the next slide. We made some fake tickets to hand out for an event. And so we really wanted people to see, like, what does a ticket actually say? Like, are you going to go to jail for 4 years for having a dirty syringe, or are you going to throw it on the ground? Like, it makes common sense why people throw their syringes and pipes on the ground when you think about it that way. And so I just wanted to pull some numbers, because when we started hearing more complaints, yes, ADA is Americans with Disabilities Act. My apologies. Sorry, I was trying to like talk fast, so I made sure we got to the questions part. And so when we looked at these cases, we were getting tickets nonstop, and we would bring it up to city council members. We would bring it up to police. Like, can you please stop criminalizing our people who are accessing health services? And the response from the police were always, well, we don't do that. They're always getting in trouble. It's always something else. It's always drugs and guns, right? And we were like, no, it's not. Like, I have the ticket in front of me. And so not all police data is transparent, but we were able to pull up a bunch of information from the uniform system that where all police agencies report into. And so I thought this was interesting because the state of Michigan, 76% of all their offenses, even if they were linked, it was with drug possession. It wasn't even with guns. And oh, you're killing me, Alexandra. Okay, so I got a few minutes, so I'm gonna go quick. But essentially, not all the reports are reported into the system. The majority of the time, people are facing paraphernalia tickets alone. And these tickets are very, very costly. They're $500 to $800. Next slide. These will all be saved, so I promise I'm just not going to go into it, but point blank, since 1991, Michigan has documentation that injection drug use was the leading cause of HIV and viral hepatitis. We've had so much advocacy in the city of Detroit with Mayor Archer, who advocated for us in Congress. And yet here it is in 2024, we still have no protections for certain service programs, the social service groups that work with us to pass out supplies, nor our participants. Next slide. Next slide. Where are we at? Well, we started working on this bill in 2019. Yeah, 2019. And nobody wanted to take it on. We finally got Rep. Brangens and some other sponsors for the bill. It got watered down a shit ton. Like, it got watered down so much. Nobody wanted to fully decrim paraphernalia. And so that is where we're at. Go ahead and go to the next slide. 5178 is the authorization of syringe service programs statewide. Thank you for posting in the chat. This one's remained idled. Like, they're not meeting quorum and we only have a few weeks till the end of the year and they're sitting on their ass. We need them to vote, point blank. They need to vote this bill out of law so we can provide services to people and so people are not criminalized for seeking services. Next slide. Again, sitting idle, 5179. Everybody, all these individuals, they're talking, we're dying, and they still won't decriminalize the test strips that they care so much about with fentanyl. The rhetoric, I think that's like really important that like we need more people pushing on. We can't be so concerned about fentanyl in our communities, which there's a lot of back history with that, but we can't be so concerned if nobody's putting action forward. It's all lip service. And so I'm going to say again, bug them, contact your senator. Yeah, lame duck, go ahead. I told you I was going to fly through this. Okay, one more minute, I promise. So lame duck or bust. If they don't move their ass, we're screwed. Done. Like at the end of the year, they don't do anything. We don't get those voted on. We're done. The bill goes away. And so they only have 8 more days. It's very competitive with other critical legislation. I'm not going to say the other legislation is not just as important because it is, but all of our oppressions are interconnected. And even if this is passed, it won't be enabled until March of next year. Next slide. Okay, call to action. Call them, bug them, sign on to our support letter. If you're an attorney, you got connections, do some pro bono work. Connect with people that are on this call. We really need your help. Okay, next. I'm all done.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Amazing information. And thanks for that call to action. Those bills have to get passed. We need those. Okay, so I am going to now discuss a little bit about what we are working on here at the Center of Behavioral Health and Justice, and then we will transition to the Q&A. So Wayne State University, let me pull this up. Okay. Wayne State University Center for Behavioral Health and Justice, we are working in partnership with the Wayne County Department of Health, Human Veteran Services to recruit community sites to participate in the Well Wayne Initiative. And the primary goal of the Well Wayne Initiative are to reduce overdose, expand access, and linkage to life-saving overdose reversal and harm reduction supplies, naloxone, as well as drug checking supplies, i.e. fentanyl testing strips and xylazine testing strips. We envision a county where all residents have naloxone and other reduction, harm reduction resources on hand. Next slide, please. The goal of the Well Wayne Station Initiative is to provide free public health vending machines and or porch boxes. So these are newsstand style storage boxes to all 43 cities within Wayne County. And we're trying to position them as low barrier access points as possible for naloxone and drug checking equipment supplies with the community. And third, to prioritize areas where there's low to no police surveillance to remove the fear of being arrested for accessing supplies. As we know, on a state and federal level, there are bills, of course, that exist to criminalize drug users. So we want people to feel as comfortable as possible accessing these vending machines and porch boxes. Next slide, please. So where are we now? Currently, we have 15 cities that have vending machines and or porch boxes placed at various organizations. And some of these organizations include faith-based organizations, marijuana dispensaries, libraries, food distribution centers, social services centers, and more. All right, and now we will transition to Q&A.